The house sat on the far end of a quiet street, the kind of place people passed without thinking twice, its pale walls catching the soft light of early morning. Nothing about it suggested that anything was wrong. From the outside, it looked peaceful, calm in a way that felt almost staged, as if the world was holding its breath. Cars rolled by at a slow pace, neighbors went about their usual routines, and the town itself moved with the steady rhythm of a place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. But inside that stillness, something heavy lingered, something no one had words for yet. It was the kind of silence that felt too clean, like it came after a storm, not before one. Just hours earlier, before the sun broke the darkness, the police had been called to the property. No sirens were used at first. The officers walked in with a strange kind of caution, sensing they were stepping into a home full of stories that hadn't been told yet. Nothing was overturned. There were no signs of struggle, no shattered glass, no blood. It was almost eerie how normal everything seemed. Toys were lined up neatly along one wall, small plastic fire trucks, soft stuffed animals, and a few faded picture books. A half-folded blanket sat on the couch. The silence felt wrong, as if the air itself had swallowed a scream. There were no bodies, no chaos, just absence, the kind that felt louder than any noise. Before the world knew anything about the million-dollar contract, the divorce, the sick children, or the choices that had led to that moment, everything had looked painfully ordinary. The people at the center of the story had lived lives that seemed simple from the outside. Work, home, bills, family. Stress, yes, but nothing unusual. Nothing that would prepare anyone for how quickly things would fall apart. The man at the center of it all had been seen that morning by a neighbor, standing next to his car with his hands tucked into his pockets, staring at the ground like he was trying to steady himself. He wasn't tall or imposing. He looked like any tired, worn-down adult who had more weight resting on his shoulders than he could admit. He had always known how to keep a straight face, how to hide the things he didn't want people to notice. People in the neighborhood described him as polite, distant, words that sounded safe, but didn't say much about who he was underneath. His wife, who most neighbors only knew through short waves and small smiles, had been the quieter one. She had a calm way of moving, almost soft in her gestures, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. She kept to herself, but those who interacted with her noticed she carried a tiredness in her eyes, something deep that she tried hard to hide. She was the kind of woman who did everything she could to make home feel safe, even when she herself didn't feel steady inside it. Then there were the triplets, 3 small children who had known more hospital rooms than playgrounds. People admired the parents for how much they seemed to juggle and wondered how they managed to stay afloat at all. The children were sweet, fragile, and far too used to being quiet when their father was around. No one really understood the family dynamic. They saw pieces of it, short interactions, rushed mornings, tired evenings, but the truth lived behind closed doors. There were nights when the wife cried alone in the bathroom, trying to muffle the sound. There were days when the husband came home with a sharpness in his voice that made the walls feel tight. He didn't hit. He didn't scream. His power showed in other ways. Long silences, cold replies, decisions made without asking, small remarks that left bruises no one could see. It was a slow kind of control, the kind that builds quietly, hiding behind excuses and forced smiles. People in town had sensed something was off between them, but no one questioned it. Couples fight, they told themselves. Tired parents snap. It's normal. No one wants to imagine that something darker might be settling in a home they pass every day. At the husband's workplace, the story was different. There, he tried to look confident, trying to impress the people above him. He wanted recognition, wanted to be seen as someone important, especially by one person, his boss. She was sharp, ambitious, and used to getting her way. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that made people want to stand. The husband admired her, maybe too much. It wasn't immediately apparent, but those close to the situation noticed the change. The way he spoke was softer around her. The way he pushed himself harder when she was watching. The way he laughed at her jokes, even when they weren't funny. And slowly, he began to see his home life as something that held him back. His sick kids became a burden. His wife's calmness became annoying. Her small smiles began to feel like reminders of everything he didn't want anymore. What no one knew, not his boss, not even his closest relatives, was that his wife had been quietly working on something big. Something that could have changed everything for their family. A contract worth more money than they had ever dreamed of. $750 million. She had kept it a secret, partly to surprise him, mostly because she feared how he would react. She didn't trust that he would be happy for her. She didn't trust that he would stay kind. And she was right. Days before the news would have reached him, he made a decision. One that would shock the entire neighborhood later, but at the time felt like the climax of something he had been planning deep inside his heart. He filed for divorce, not because of fights, not because of the stress at home, but because there was something he wanted more: power, comfort, status. And his boss offered all those things in a way his wife never could. He told no one the real reason. He played the victim, pretending life at home had worn him down. He left his wife alone with the triplets, knowing full well what their illnesses required, knowing the nights of worry she'd face, the hospital visits she'd handle alone, the fear she'd have to swallow when the children struggled to breathe. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was how that silent house, the one police officers now stood in, would soon become the center of a storm bigger than anything he believed he controlled. Everything looked normal that morning. But nothing was normal. And everything was about to break. The tension didn't explode all at once. It gathered slowly, slipping into the spaces between normal days, building in moments that felt harmless at first. It showed up in the tone of a sentence, in the pause after a question, in the way two people looked at each other a second too long. It grew in the quiet corners of the house, in the workplace hallways, and deep inside the minds of the people involved, twisting the story into something none of them could escape. It began with the husband's late nights at work. At first, he blamed deadlines. Then he blamed pressure from above. His wife believed him because she wanted to, because she had always tried to see the good in him even when it wasn't easy. But truthfully, the late nights had nothing to do with pressure. They had everything to do with his boss, her attention, her praise, the flattering way she lifted him up while making him feel important. It was a feeling he had never gotten at home, mostly because he never earned it. He had begun to enjoy the way she looked at him, like he was someone worth noticing. He dressed better for work, sprayed more cologne, and practiced quick smiles in the car mirror before going inside. She wasn't subtle either. She complimented him in ways that crossed lines. She asked personal questions. She gave him a kind of warmth that wasn't real but felt real enough for him. And behind her eyes there was a hunger, not for him as a person, but for the power she could wield over him. At home, the change was immediate. The husband had always been distant, but now he became colder, like he was slowly peeling himself away from the family. His wife felt it instantly. She noticed the way he sighed when the children asked for help, how he rolled his eyes when she mentioned hospital appointments, how he muttered under his breath when one of the kids had a coughing fit at night. Every sound annoyed him. Every need felt like a chain, and he blamed her for all of it. One night, she asked him directly what was wrong. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at her with an expression she had never seen before, something like disgust mixed with annoyance, like she was interrupting a life he wanted to live without her. "You're always stressed," he finally said. "You drag the whole house down." The words stung so sharply she had to swallow twice before she could breathe. She tried to explain that she was tired, that the kids were getting worse, that she needed help. But he brushed it all off, said she was exaggerating, said she needed to be stronger. He walked out of the room while she was still talking. That night, she cried herself to sleep again, but this time it felt different. This time, she felt herself slipping into a kind of loneliness she couldn't name, one that made her afraid of what her future would look like if he kept moving away from them. Around the same time, the wife's secret project, the massive contract, began nearing its final steps. She had been working with a team privately for months, pushing through long nights, studying documents, writing proposals, proving herself over and over. It was her chance to change everything for her children. The money wouldn't cure them, but it would secure their treatment for years. It would give them a home with fewer fears. It would give them futures she had never thought possible. But every time she thought about telling her husband, her stomach tightened. She pictured his reaction, how he might twist it, how he might claim credit for it, how he might use it against her. She knew him well enough to know he didn't like it when she succeeded. He rarely said it aloud, but she could feel it in the way he reacted any time she showed confidence. He needed to be the one who succeeded. He needed to be the one people looked up to. So she kept the secret. Not because she wanted to surprise him anymore, but because she needed to protect herself from whatever he would do with that kind of news. Meanwhile, the husband was spinning his own story at work. He told his boss that his wife didn't understand him, that the house felt like a burden, that the children's illnesses were draining him. He painted himself as a man trapped in a life he never asked for, making himself look like someone who deserved something better, someone like her. His boss wasn't moved by pity. She was moved by opportunity. She saw the way he clung to her approval. She saw how easily he could be controlled, so she fed it. She told him he was talented, special, worth more than the life he had. She made him feel chosen. She knew exactly how to guide him, how to make him believe that everything he wanted was in her hands. The husband liked this version of himself, the one she reflected at him. He started to believe he deserved that life, that he deserved to escape the one he had at home. It wasn't long before he began telling friends that he and his wife were growing apart. He didn't mention his boss. He didn't mention his deliberate emotional distance. Instead, he blamed the stress of the triplets' condition. He framed himself as a man barely holding things together. The truth was uglier. He wasn't cracking under pressure, he was searching for a way out. The children felt the shift too. Kids always do, even when adults think they're hiding things. They started to grow quiet when their father came into the room, unsure of how to behave around him. They clung to their mother more, sensing she was the only safe place left. One night, one of the triplets whispered to her, "Why does Daddy smile at us anymore?" She didn't have an answer. At the same time, hidden away in emails and confidential documents, the wife's contract reached approval. $750 million, more money than she had ever imagined touching in her entire life. When she held the final confirmation in her hands, her fingers trembled. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the numbers until her eyes blurred. She thought of the children, of surgeries, therapies, medical teams, new equipment, hope. But instead of celebration, fear crawled up her throat. How would he react? Would this make things better, or would it break the last pieces of what they still had? Outside pressures pushed everyone harder. The husband's boss started inviting him to private meetings, long ones, behind closed doors. She began hinting at roles he could have in the company if he were unrestricted in his personal life. She played the part of a mentor, but there was something else underneath, something personal, something dangerous. On one particularly heavy evening, while his wife fed the children soup and tried to get them to take their medication, he stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. Not with love, not with admiration, but with resentment. He saw a woman who was tired, worn down, and struggling under the weight of responsibilities he didn't want. He saw someone who reminded him of everything he wished he could run from. And then he thought about his boss, confident, strong, powerful. Everything his wife was. He made his decision in that moment. The next morning, he filed for divorce. He didn't warn her, he didn't talk to her, he didn't even think about what this would do to the children. He simply pushed the papers toward her and said, "Sign them." She stared at him like she didn't recognize him anymore. Her voice shook when she asked, "Why now did I do something?" He didn't answer the question, he just told her it was for the best. She refused to sign, not out of hope for the marriage, but because the timing made no sense. Because something about the way he avoided her eyes made her stomach twist. Because there was something else hiding behind his sudden desire for freedom. In the weeks that followed, the house grew colder. He became a visitor in his own home, floating in and out whenever he wanted, avoiding the children, ignoring his wife. He would stand in the hallway scrolling through his phone while she handled medical emergencies alone. He would leave early in the morning and return late at night, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers. The wife felt herself breaking, not loudly but quietly in small pieces. She started losing sleep. She started questioning everything she thought she knew about him. And then, at her lowest, she decided on her own. She would tell him about the contract. Not to win him back, but because the money was meant for the children, and he needed to know that their lives were about to change. But when she finally told him, when she whispered the numbers in a shaking voice, expecting maybe a flicker of shock or joy or pride, she saw something else entirely. His eyes widened, not with happiness but with calculation. In that instant, she realized something chilling. He wasn't leaving because he was unhappy. He was leaving because he wanted something more. Something that wasn't hers alone anymore. From that moment on, everything spiraled. Every conversation turned sharp. Every glance felt dangerous. She started to hide documents, lock drawers, and back up files, afraid he might take what she had worked so hard for. He became more careless, more arrogant, more openly connected to his boss. And somewhere inside him, a darker thought began to take shape. He wanted the money. He wanted the life he thought he deserved. And he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Not even her, not even the children. The tension in that house grew dense enough to choke on. Neighbors noticed the shift, the drawn blinds, the rushed voices, the way the wife flinched whenever the husband's car pulled into the driveway. But no one said anything. No one knew how deep the cracks ran. What none of them realized was that the breaking point was already set. Every secret, every lie, every moment of manipulation, every cold choice. They were all leading the family to a moment that would shatter everything that had once looked normal from the outside. The world around them kept moving forward. But inside that house, the countdown had already begun. The night it happened didn't start with screaming or a fight. It began in a way that almost made the ending feel unreal, quiet still, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. The sky outside was heavy and dark, the kind of night where the air feels thick. The house was dim, the lights low to help the triplets sleep, and shadows stretched across the walls like they were holding secrets. The wife had spent the whole day with the children. One of the boys had been struggling to breathe again, and she had held him for hours, rocking him slowly until his chest eased. By the time evening came, she was wiped out, emotionally and physically drained. She had barely eaten, barely rested, and her thoughts kept circling back to the same fear. Her husband wanted something that didn't belong to him. The contract, the money, the future she had built, it all hung in the air between them. She knew he was coming home late again. She could always tell when it was going to be one of those nights. She felt it in the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She tucked the children into bed and kissed their foreheads one by one. They were pale, tired, but peaceful. For a moment she allowed herself to stop and breathe, but the quiet only made her heart beat faster. Outside, the sound of a car drifting into the driveway made her stomach twist. She didn't rush to see him. She stayed in the hallway, listening as he shut the car door harder than needed. The front door opened, and footsteps echoed through the house, slow, deliberate. She could smell his cologne before he even appeared, a scent she used to like but now made her chest tighten. When he reached the living room, he didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the children. He didn't ask if she was okay after the long day. He just looked at her like she was an obstacle, something he had to push past. "We need to talk," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was flat, empty, like he had practiced the conversation in his head over and over until he could say it without emotion. She told him the kids were asleep, hoping he would lower his voice, but he didn't care. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and stood there staring at the counter as if he were weighing something heavy in his mind. She followed him quietly, unsure of what he was planning. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to make things worse. She just wanted her children to be safe. She wanted to survive the night. But he had already crossed a line in his mind. He turned toward her with a coldness she had never seen before, not even during the harshest moments of their marriage. He asked her again about the contract, asked where the documents were, asked why she hadn't handed everything over. She told him the truth, that the contract was tied to her name alone, that the company trusted her, not him, and that the money was meant for the children, not for his ambitions. That was the moment something snapped inside him. It didn't happen loudly, it wasn't dramatic. It was a small shift, the way someone's expression changes right before they make a choice they can't take back. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, his voice dropped lower. "You think you can take everything from me?" he said. "You think you can make me look like I'm nothing?" She shook her head, tears already forming, but he didn't believe her. He had convinced himself of a story where he was the victim, where she was the one hurting him, where the only way to win was to take control. Then he stepped toward her. She backed away instinctively, her hands trembling. She told him the children were sleeping, told him they didn't need to do this, told him she was scared. But he wasn't listening. He grabbed her wrist too hard. She tried to pull away, but he held on, squeezing until she felt a sharp pain shoot up her arm. She told him to stop, begged him to calm down, but the more she pleaded, the more anger filled his face became. He pushed her, and she stumbled into the table, knocking over the glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound slicing through the house. The sound woke one of the triplets. A soft cry drifted down the hallway, fragile and scared. She turned toward the sound, her instinct pulling her toward her child, but he grabbed her again, yanking her back. He wasn't thinking about the children. He wasn't thinking about her. His mind was locked on the money, the contract, the life he believed she owed him. His voice rose, no longer flat. "Give me the documents." She told him she didn't have them there. She told him she would show him later. Anything to calm him down, anything to stop what was happening. But he felt the lie in her voice, or at least he believed he did. In that moment, his anger grew into something darker, fear mixed with greed, desperation mixed with pride. He shoved her again, harder this time. Her body hit the edge of the counter. The breath left her lungs with a choked gasp. She tried to steady herself, but her vision blurred. She tasted blood. She tried to push him back, but he only grew more frantic, packing, shaking, running his hands through his hair like he was losing his grip. She whispered his name, begging him to stop, reminding him of the children, reminding him of who he was. For a brief second, his eyes softened, and she thought maybe, he would sit down, breathe, let the storm pass. But then he thought about his boss, about the future he believed he deserved, about the power he thought the money would give him, about how he had already told too many lies to turn back now. The moment twisted. He stepped closer again. She tried to run, but his hand grabbed her from behind, pulling her back with such force she lost her balance. Her foot slipped on the wet floor where the water had spilled from the broken glass. She fell hard, hitting her head against the tile. The sound was sharp and sickening. He froze. For a second, everything went quiet. The house felt painfully still, as if even the walls were trying to understand what had just happened. She didn't scream, she didn't move. She lay there, eyes half open, chest rising in small, shallow breaths. He stared at her like he was watching something he couldn't undo, something he hadn't actually meant to happen, not like this. He crouched beside her, shaking her, telling her to wake up, saying her name over and over. His voice cracked in a way that made it clear he wasn't feeling guilt. He was feeling fear. Fear of consequences, fear of losing control, fear of being exposed for everything he had done. Behind them, one of the children cried again, louder this time, scared by the chaos. He panicked. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but real. For a second, relief washed over him. But then another thought crashed through him. If she woke up, she would tell, she would expose him. He would lose everything, his job, his boss, his new life. He looked toward the hallway where the children were, then back to his wife. That second became the most dangerous moment of all. His mind raced, torn between fear and the hunger that had been eating away at him for months. He could walk away, he could call for help, he could save her. But he didn't. He made another choice. He covered her mouth with his hand, whispering her name as if he were comforting her, but his grip tightened. She moved weakly, trying to breathe, trying to push him away, but she was too hurt, too dazed. His hand stayed where it was, too long, too hard, driven by panic and the belief that this was his only escape. When her body finally went still, he pulled his hand back slowly, staring down at her like he couldn't understand what he had done. A part of him had expected the world to shift, to crack open and punish him instantly. But nothing happened. The house stayed quiet. The children stayed in their room. The night stayed dark. Silence wrapped around him again. He stood up, trembling but trying to steady himself. He wiped his hands on his shirt, packing in circles as his mind clawed for a solution. He wanted to undo it. He wanted to pretend it wasn't real. But the truth lay on the floor, unmoving. His thoughts turned cold again. He told himself it was an accident. He told himself she slipped. He told himself he had no choice. He walked into the bedroom, took her phone, deleted messages, and looked for anything that might point back to him. He checked the drawers for documents, desperate to find the contract papers, but she had hidden them well. Each empty drawer pushed him deeper into panic. The children were awake now, soft cries echoing through the hallway. He went into their room, not with love, but with the frantic energy of someone trying to keep everything from collapsing. He whispered that everything was okay, told them to go back to sleep. But they kept crying, sensing that something terrible had happened. He didn't comfort them. He didn't hold them. He just closed the door. Then he returned to the living room, staring at the scene he had created. He thought about calling his boss. He thought about driving away. He thought about leaving the children behind. Each thought flashed through him like sparks hitting dry wood. The truth finally settled into him, with a weight that made his knees weak. He hadn't just broken his marriage. He had destroyed his life. He had crossed a line no one comes back from. And the house, once full of fragile hope, now felt like a trap closing around him. Outside, the night stayed silent. Inside, everything was already ruined. In the hours after the crime, the husband moved through the house like a man trapped inside a nightmare he still thought he could wake himself from. He wiped the counter where her head had struck, cleaned the glass from the floor, and washed the blood off his hands until his skin felt raw. Every movement was frantic, but there was a strange kind of calm in him too, an empty, numb calm that convinced him he still had control. He told himself over and over that he hadn't meant to do it, that she had slipped, that panic had made everything worse. He repeated the lie until it started to feel close enough to the truth that he could breathe again. But no matter how much he tried to steady himself, the house wouldn't let him forget. Her shoes were near the door, her sweater was thrown over the couch. The children's drawings were on the fridge with her handwriting in the corner. Everything reminded him of the woman who had filled the home with warmth he never appreciated until it was gone. The children's soft crying drifted from their room again. He leaned against the wall, squeezing his eyes shut, begging them silently to stop. But they wouldn't. They felt the change in the air. They felt the darkness that had settled over the house. They cried not because of noise or hunger, but because something inside them knew their world had just broken. He didn't go in to comfort them. He couldn't. He didn't know how to face them now, not after what he had done to their mother. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and left through the back door, slipping into the night like a man running from his own shadow. He drove aimlessly for hours, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't think straight. He talked to himself, argued with himself, and convinced himself that no jury would believe he intended to hurt her. "People slip every day," he whispered into the empty car. "It was an accident, it was." But deep down, underneath all his desperate reasoning, there was a sharp truth cutting into him. He had crossed the line with full awareness of what he was doing. He had let fear and greed drag him into a moment that could never be undone. While he drove in circles, the house stayed still and cold. The children eventually cried themselves to sleep. In the living room, the silence thickened around the woman he had silenced forever. Hours passed, and the sun slowly began to rise, brushing the sky with pale color. The world outside woke up as if nothing had changed. The children woke first. One of the boys tried to climb out of bed, dragging his small feet across the floor as he searched for his mother. When he found her on the kitchen floor, he didn't understand. He touched her arm, nudged her gently, whispered, "Mama," again and again, hoping she was only sleeping. When she didn't answer, confusion turned into terror. The other two children ran out, crying her name. Their panicked voices finally reached the neighbors, who heard the cries and rushed over. One of them, an older woman who had watched the family for years, stepped inside and froze when she saw the scene. Her scream spread through the neighborhood like a shockwave. Within minutes, sirens filled the air. Police, paramedics, neighbors pouring out of their homes, whispering, gasping, covering their mouths. Some cried openly. Others stood in stunned silence. No one could believe that the woman who smiled at everyone, who carried her sick children to and from appointments without complaint, who worked quietly and humbly, was gone. And no one could understand where her husband was. When he returned and saw the street filled with flashing lights, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he considered driving away again. But he forced himself out of the car and ran toward the house, pretending he didn't know what he would find. He acted shocked, widened eyes, trembling hands, helpless questions. "What happened? What happened to her?" He tried to run toward her body, but officers held him back. They asked him where he had been. They asked him why he left the children alone. His answers were messy, falling apart under pressure, full of holes he couldn't hide. The children clung to the female officer who knelt beside them, crying so hard their bodies shook. They kept calling for their mother, pointing toward the kitchen, begging someone to help her. The husband tried to reach for them, but they pulled away, terrified of him in a way the officers immediately noticed. The investigation began that same morning, and the cracks in his story showed instantly. The bruises on her wrist didn't match a fall. The marks on her face and neck told a different story, one of force, panic, and violence. The broken glass pattern on the floor didn't align with what he claimed. His clothes, his phone records, the fresh scratches on his forearms, everything pointed toward one conclusion. And the worst part for him was that the children had heard the fight. Their words were small, broken, but clear enough to destroy the lie he was holding on to. Mama said stop, Mama cried, Daddy pushed. When the police told him he was being detained for questioning, his body finally broke. He collapsed to the ground, sobbing, begging to fix it, begging to explain, but the more he talked, the deeper he sank. He said he loved her. He said he didn't mean it. He said she slipped. He said she made him angry. He said she had hidden things from him. He said anything he could think of, even when the officers told him to stop. But nothing could rewrite the truth. News traveled fast. By noon, reporters gathered outside the home. The story spread across social media. A young mother was found dead. Husband detained. Children discovered crying beside her body. Photos of her smiling with the triplets' bright, sweet faces flooded the internet. Her name trended. People wrote tributes for her. Family friends shared stories of her kindness, her dedication to her children, and her gentle spirit. Then the bombshell dropped. She had just secured a $750 million contract that was meant to change her children's future. That detail changed everything about public perception. People were horrified, furious. The story became larger than a domestic tragedy. It became a symbol of greed, betrayal, and power twisted into something monstrous. As for the boss, she distanced herself immediately. She erased messages, deleted calls, pretended she barely knew him. But investigators found enough. Enough texts, enough emails, enough late-night communications. And though she wasn't charged with the crime, her reputation was shattered. The company placed her on leave. The public dragged her name through every corner of the internet. The children were taken into protective care first, then placed with a relative who held them so tightly she cried into their hair. They kept asking if their mother was coming back. They kept waking up screaming at night. They couldn't understand why the world they knew had fallen apart in a single evening. At the police station, the husband sat in a small, cold room, his hands cuffed, his face pale. The weight of what he had done pressed so heavily on him that he could barely breathe. His mind played the moment again and again. The shove, the fall, the panic, the hand over her mouth. Each replay made him tremble harder. He told himself he was a good man who made a mistake, but even he didn't believe it anymore. The guilt ripped through him, but it wasn't the guilt of losing her. It was the guilt of losing the life he wanted, the future he thought he deserved. By evening, the community turned her house into a memorial. Candles lined the driveway, flowers piled on the porch. People cried openly, some hugging each other, others staring in disbelief at the home that had once looked so normal. Her spoke about her brilliance, her humility. Parents from the Triplets support group shared how they never complained despite carrying more than most people could bear. Not a single person had anything kind to say about him. Even those who once liked him shook their heads in disgust. They talked about the signs they missed, the moments where they should have checked on her, the times he seemed off, but they shrugged it away. Now the truth lay in the open. The man who wanted power threw away the only people who truly loved him. The woman who deserved the world died at the hands of the man she trusted. And 3 children would grow up carrying a story they never asked for. The house stayed dark that night, the silence heavy with everything broken inside it. The community mourned. The family mourned. And the man who caused all the pain finally realized that no amount of lies could save him from the truth that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the months that followed, the story settled into the corners of people's minds like dust that refused to be wiped away. Even after the court hearings ended, after the news channels moved on to newer scandals, and after strangers stopped whispering the family's name, the damage remained. It lived in the quiet moments, empty rooms, unanswered questions, and the heavy pause that came whenever someone tried to imagine how things could have turned out differently. Justice had been served, at least on paper, but no one could pretend that justice brought peace. Daniel sat alone in the small room assigned to him in the state prison, staring at the wall as if it held the answers he never dared to look for before. There was no noise except the low hum of the lights overhead and the occasional shout of another inmate down the hall. He didn't fight his sentence. He hardly said a word during the trial. His lawyer tried to argue stress, emotional collapse, even temporary insanity, but Daniel never backed any of it. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply shook his head. It wasn't defiance. It was emptiness, a hollow space where pride and ambition once lived. Some said he deserved even worse. Others thought he had already punished himself long before the police ever arrived that night. But the truth was less satisfying. Daniel wasn't a monster who woke up one morning and chose destruction. He was a man who let his fears, his jealousy, and his hunger for status lead him step by step into a darkness he could no longer crawl out of. And that was the part that unsettled people. The crime didn't come from something strange or supernatural. It came from something painfully human. Across town, tried to carve out a future she never expected to face. She moved to a quiet neighborhood where no one knew her story, at least for the moment. But she could still feel people's eyes lingering on her when she went out to buy groceries or when she walked the twins to their therapist appointments. Curiosity traveled faster than truth. Some people her. Others blamed her for not seeing the signs earlier, as if she had chosen the turmoil that swallowed her life. But she learned to keep her head up, even on the days when the weight of everything pressed so hard on her chest she could barely breathe. The Triplets were the ones who carried the heaviest silence. They didn't talk much about what happened. They didn't ask questions. They didn't cry in the ways people expected. Instead, the sadness settled in subtle ways, hesitation before speaking, long pauses before answering simple questions, and nightmares that left them trembling but unwilling to talk. Their doctors said healing would take years, maybe longer. Trauma didn't follow a schedule. Still, tried to give them pieces of normal life where she could. She cooked dinner every night, even when they barely touched their food. She sat beside them during appointments and held their hands when their voices shook. She didn't try to erase what they had seen or felt. She simply wanted them to believe that life could still offer moments of safety, even if trust felt like something fragile that could shatter without warning. The public had its own reactions to the case. People debated it endlessly, online, at workplaces, in coffee shops. Some argued that Daniel was a selfish husband who cared more about status than his own family. Others saw him as a man crushed under financial pressure, manipulated by a system that rewarded greed over honesty. A few even sympathized with him, saying that anyone could break if pushed far enough. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. The entire story left a mark, a reminder of how quickly a life could fall apart. The wealthy business circle that once praised Daniel avoided his name completely. They didn't want to be connected to a scandal that exposed the cracks in their own world, where appearances mattered more than loyalty, and success was measured by who you stood beside rather than who you cared for. Even his boss, the woman he tried so hard to impress, rewrote her version of events to make herself appear distant and uninvolved. She said she barely knew him. She said there had been no relationship, no whispered promises, no manipulation. People believed her because it was easier. If there was any silver lining, it came from the larger conversations that followed. Advocates used the case to talk about emotional abuse, financial control, and the way power imbalances could push relationships into dangerous territory. They pointed out how quickly someone could lose themselves when chasing approval or fearing failure. Schools invited speakers to discuss warning signs in relationships. Community centers held free counseling sessions for couples under financial stress. It didn't erase what happened, but it helped others see the patterns before they grew into something impossible to escape. In quieter spaces, the story raised deeper questions, ones without simple answers. People wondered how love could twist into something unrecognizable. They wondered how someone could live beside a person for years without seeing their breaking point. They wondered if trust was ever truly safe, or if everyone carried hidden tunnels in their hearts that no one else could reach. For the most painful part was not the betrayal or even the violence. It was looking back at the countless moments where she tried to explain her worries, only to be brushed aside. She replayed every argument, every uneasy silence, every time Daniel chose pride over family. And yet, even with all those memories, she still didn't see herself as a victim. She saw herself as someone who survived something that should have destroyed her. She saw herself as someone who learned to rebuild, even when the world she knew collapsed without warning. She visited the prison once, months after the sentencing, not to reconcile, not to forgive. She went because she needed to see the truth with her own eyes. When Daniel walked into the visitation room, he looked thinner, older, as if time moved differently inside those walls. He didn't meet her eyes at first. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled in a way she had never heard before. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I don't forgive myself." She didn't answer right away. She didn't know what to say. Anger didn't fill her the way she imagined it would. Pity didn't either. What she felt was something quieter, a tired sadness for a man who had ruined his life by trying to be someone he was never meant to be. "I hope you find something to hold on to in here," she finally said. "Something better than the things you chased before." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't comfort, it was simply the truth. When she walked out of the building, the air felt colder than she expected, but it also felt clean. She took a long breath, steadying herself. There was still a long road ahead, court-ordered counseling for the children, legal battles over the remaining assets, and the constant challenge of helping her family heal. But for the first time, she felt like she was walking toward something instead of away from it. As for society, the case became a cautionary tale of how quickly ambition could turn toxic, how easily relationships could break when control took the place of love, and how hidden fears could lead to choices that could never be undone. People were reminded that crime didn't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes, it came from someone sitting at the same dinner table, smiling across the room, promising things they never intended to keep. In the end, justice wasn't about punishment alone. It was about understanding how fragile people could be, how deeply circumstances shaped them, and how every decision, big or small, carried a ripple that touched others in ways they might never see. Daniel lived with the consequences of his choices behind concrete walls and locked doors, lived with the responsibility of rebuilding a future for herself and her children, and society carried the memory of a tragedy born from pride, pressure, and the quiet cracks that formed long before the world noticed. The story closed not with triumph or bitterness, but with reflection, on love that failed, on trust that shattered, and on the complicated truths of what people were capable of when pushed beyond their limits. And though life moved forward, the lessons lingered, reminding everyone who heard the story that the human heart could be both fragile and dangerous, and that the search for power, approval, or escape could destroy far more than it ever promised to give.